Champions vs. Creatures, Epic Adventure in Post-Apocalyptic Survival Warfare. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned highway as Marcus Thompson adjusted his grip on the modified crossbow, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. 3 years had passed since the outbreak turned civilization into a nightmare, and the former Marine had learned to trust his instincts above all else. Behind him, the sound of approaching footsteps made him turn, revealing his younger sister Emma emerging from the overturned bus they'd used as shelter for the night. Her medical bag was slung across her shoulder, a constant reminder of her role as the group's healer in this broken world. "Any sign of them?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the morning stillness. Marcus shook his head, but his expression remained tense. The group of survivors they'd been tracking had promised to meet them at this exact location, bringing news of a potential safe zone somewhere in the Northern Territories. As if summoned by their conversation, the distant rumble of an engine broke the silence. A heavily armored truck emerged from behind a collapsed overpass, its metal plating scarred by countless encounters with the undead. The vehicle slowed as it approached, and Marcus could make out 3 figures in the cab. The driver was Jake Rodriguez, a former mechanic whose skills had kept their vehicles running through impossible conditions. Beside him sat Rebecca Walsh, a sharp-eyed former police detective whose tactical knowledge had saved their lives more times than anyone could count. In the passenger seat, David Kim clutched a tablet displaying what appeared to be satellite imagery, his background in communications technology making him invaluable for gathering intelligence about safe routes and potential threats. The truck came to a stop, and Jake killed the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after days of constant travel. Rebecca was the first to exit, her hand instinctively resting on the pistol at her hip as she surveyed their surroundings. "We've got news," she announced, her voice carrying both hope and caution. "David managed to intercept some radio chatter last night. There's definitely something happening up north, but it's not what we expected." David climbed down from the truck, his tablet still in hand, and began pulling up the information he'd gathered. The screen showed a rough map of the region, with several marked locations that seemed to form a pattern. "According to the transmissions I picked up, there's a group calling themselves the Northern Alliance," David explained, his finger tracing routes on the digital map. "They've established multiple strongholds and claim to have developed some kind of defense system against the infected. But here's the concerning part, they're also broadcasting warnings about something they call evolved variants." The word sent a chill through the group. They'd all encountered the standard infected, shambling corpses driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh, but the idea of evolution suggested something far more dangerous. Emma stepped closer to examine the tablet, her medical training making her particularly interested in any biological developments. "What kind of evolution are we talking about?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. David scrolled through his notes, pulling up fragments of the intercepted communications. "From what I could piece together, these variants are faster, stronger, and apparently capable of basic problem-solving. The Alliance forces have encountered them in coordinated attacks, suggesting some level of pack intelligence." Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he processed this information. 3 years of fighting the undead had taught him that adaptation was the key to survival, but if the infected were also adapting, the rules of engagement would need to change dramatically. "How reliable is this intelligence?" he asked, his military background making him naturally skeptical of unverified reports. Rebecca pulled out a worn notebook, flipping to pages covered in her careful handwriting. "I've been cross-referencing David's intercepts with reports from other survivor groups we've encountered. There's definitely a pattern emerging. Multiple sources are describing similar encounters with infected that display enhanced capabilities." Jake, who had been quietly checking their vehicle's fuel levels, looked up from his work. "So what's the plan? Do we still head north, or do we find another route?" The question hung in the air as each member of the group considered their options. They'd been traveling for weeks, following rumors and radio signals in search of a place where they could finally stop running. The promise of the Northern Alliance had given them hope, but the news of evolved variants complicated everything. Emma was the first to speak, her voice steady despite the uncertainty they faced. "We need more information before we make any major decisions. If these variants are real, we need to understand what we're dealing with." She gestured toward the medical supplies in her bag. "I've been studying tissue samples from the infected we've encountered, trying to understand the biological mechanisms behind the outbreak. If there's been some kind of mutation or evolution, there might be patterns we can identify." David nodded in agreement, already thinking about the technical challenges ahead. "I can try to establish better communication with the Northern Alliance, maybe get more detailed information about these variants. If they've developed countermeasures, we need to know what they are." The group stood in contemplative silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts about the path ahead. The abandoned highway stretched endlessly in both directions, a stark reminder of how far civilization had fallen and how uncertain their future remained. The decision to continue north was made with heavy hearts and loaded weapons. As their convoy of 2 vehicles wound through the skeletal remains of what had once been thriving suburbs, the team maintained constant radio contact, their voices crackling through the static-filled airwaves. Marcus drove the lead vehicle with Emma beside him, while Rebecca and David followed in Jake's armored truck. The landscape told the story of humanity's rapid fall. Abandoned cars lined the roadside like metallic tombstones, their doors hanging open as silent testimony to their owners' desperate final moments. Overgrown vegetation had begun to reclaim the asphalt, creating an eerie contrast between nature's persistence and civilization's fragility. "Movement at 2 o'clock, Rebecca's voice cut through the radio chatter, her trained eye catching something the others had missed. Through the passenger window of the trailing vehicle, she could see shapes moving between the collapsed remains of a shopping center. The figures moved with the characteristic shambling gait of the infected, but something about their behavior seemed different. Instead of the random wandering they'd grown accustomed to, these infected appeared to be moving with purpose, following what looked like a deliberate path through the debris. Marcus brought his vehicle to a gradual stop, not wanting to attract attention with sudden movements or engine noise. In the rearview mirror, he watched Jake's truck pull up behind them, maintaining the tactical spacing they'd practiced countless times. Emma raised her binoculars, focusing on the distant figures as she tried to get a better assessment of what they were dealing with. "I count at least 12, she reported quietly into her radio. "But Marcus, they're not behaving like the ones we usually encounter. They're moving in formation." The observation sent a chill through the group. Standard infected were driven by basic instinct, drawn to noise and movement without any apparent coordination. What Emma was describing suggested a level of organization that aligned disturbingly well with David's intelligence about evolved variants. Jake's voice came through the radio, tense but controlled. "Should we engage or find an alternate route? We've got enough ammunition, but if these things are as dangerous as the reports suggest, we might want to avoid unnecessary contact." David was already pulling up alternative routes on his tablet, his fingers moving quickly across the digital map as he calculated distances and fuel consumption. "There's a service road about 2 miles back that should take us around this area," he reported. "It'll add maybe an hour to our travel time, but it keeps us away from whatever's happening over there." Rebecca kept her binoculars trained on the infected group, her police training making her reluctant to leave without gathering more intelligence. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying a note of concern. "They've stopped moving. It's like they're listening." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of wind moving through abandoned buildings. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, the infected began moving again, but this time their direction had changed. They were heading directly toward the road where the survivors sat in their vehicles. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he realized their presence had somehow been detected despite their efforts to remain quiet and hidden. "Everyone stay calm," he instructed through the radio. "We're going to back up slowly and take that alternate route David mentioned." But as Marcus shifted into reverse, the sound of his engine seemed to trigger something in the approaching infected. Their shambling walk transformed into a coordinated run, and for the first time, the survivors could hear something that made their blood run cold. The infected were making sounds that resembled communication. Not the mindless moaning they were accustomed to, but what sounded almost like crude vocalizations, as if they were coordinating their approach. Emma's medical training kicked in as she observed the infected's movement patterns. "Marcus, their motor control is completely different from what we've seen before," she said, her voice tight with scientific fascination and growing fear. "Standard infected have compromised neural function that affects coordination. These ones are moving like their nervous systems are intact." The implications of her observation were terrifying. If the infected retained their physical capabilities while losing their humanity, they would be far more dangerous than anything the group had previously encountered. Jake's truck roared to life behind them as he prepared to execute a rapid retreat. "Marcus, we need to move now," he urged through the radio. "I count more movement coming from the other side of the shopping center. We're about to be surrounded." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Marcus knew they had only seconds to act before their escape route was cut off. He gunned the engine, his vehicle lurching backward as he began the dangerous maneuver of reversing at high speed while maintaining control. Rebecca continued her observations even as they retreated, her analytical mind working to gather every piece of information that might prove useful later. "They're definitely communicating," she reported. "And they're not just chasing us randomly. They're trying to hurt us toward something." The realization that they were dealing with infected capable of tactical thinking changed everything about their survival strategy. These weren't mindless predators they could outrun or outsmart with simple tactics. As they reached the service road David had identified, the infected pursuit seemed to falter, as if the creatures had reached some predetermined boundary. The survivors didn't slow down until they'd put several miles between themselves and the shopping center, finally stopping at what appeared to be an abandoned gas station to regroup and process what they'd witnessed. The encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had fundamentally altered their understanding of the threat they faced. Emma was already making notes in her medical journal, documenting the behavioral differences they'd observed, while David worked to update their intelligence files with this new information about the evolved variant's capabilities. The abandoned gas station provided temporary refuge, but the team's nerves remained on edge as they gathered around Jake's truck to discuss their encounter. The building's windows had been boarded up long ago, and weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, creating an atmosphere of desolation that matched their growing unease. Marcus paced back and forth, his military training warring with the unsettling reality of what they'd just witnessed. "We need to reassess everything we thought we knew about the infected," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that could mean life or death for his team. Emma spread her medical notes across the truck's hood, her handwriting documenting 3 years of observations about infected behavior and physiology. "The standard infected we've been dealing with show clear signs of neurological degradation," she explained, pointing to sketches and data she'd collected. "Impaired motor function, loss of higher cognitive abilities, basic stimulus response patterns. What we just saw contradicts everything I've documented." She looked up at her companions, her expression troubled. "If these variants have retained cognitive function while maintaining the infected's apparent immunity to pain and fatigue, we're dealing with something exponentially more dangerous." David's tablet chimed with an incoming transmission, and he quickly adjusted his equipment to improve the signal clarity. The voice that emerged from the speakers was distorted by static, but the urgency in the tone was unmistakable. "This is Northern Alliance Station 7 calling any survivors in the southern approach zones. We have multiple reports of coordinated infected activity in your area. If you can hear this transmission, avoid all major population centers and maintain radio silence except for emergency communications." The message continued with coordinates for what the speaker described as a safe corridor, but the transmission cut out before they could gather complete information. Jake immediately began checking their fuel levels and mechanical systems, his practical mind focusing on the logistics of survival. "We've got enough gas to reach those coordinates," he reported, "but if we're going into unknown territory with these evolved infected around, we need to make sure everything's running perfectly." Rebecca had been studying their road maps, cross-referencing the partial coordinates they'd received with known geographic features. "The safe corridor they mentioned runs through some pretty rough terrain," she observed. Lots of choke points where we could get trapped if something goes wrong. But the alternative routes take us through areas where we've already confirmed infected presence. The tactical implications were clear. They were being forced to choose between known dangers and unknown risks. As they prepared to move out, Emma noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the distance, barely visible through the heat shimmer rising from the asphalt, she could see figures moving along the horizon. They weren't approaching directly, but they seemed to be maintaining a parallel course to the road the survivors would need to take. "We're being tracked," she announced quietly, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "They're not attacking, but they're definitely following us." Marcus raised his binoculars, confirming Emma's observation. The infected were maintaining their distance, moving with the same coordinated behavior they'd witnessed earlier. "It's like they're hurting us," he muttered, the tactical implications becoming increasingly clear. "They're not trying to catch us right now. They're trying to control where we go." The realization that they were dealing with infected capable of strategic thinking fundamentally changed their situation from a simple survival scenario to something resembling warfare. David managed to re-establish contact with the Northern Alliance transmission, and this time the signal was stronger. "Alliance Station 7, this is Survivor Group Delta requesting immediate guidance. We have visual confirmation of coordinated infected behavior and believe we're being tracked by evolved variants." The response came quickly, the voice on the other end carrying a note of grim recognition. "Survivor Group Delta, you're describing what we call shepherding behavior. The evolved variants use this tactic to drive survivors toward larger infected concentrations. You need to break the pattern immediately." The Alliance operator provided rapid-fire instructions for evasive maneuvers, including techniques for masking their vehicle signatures and creating false trails to confuse their pursuers. "The key is unpredictability," the voice explained. The evolved variants seem to anticipate logical survival behavior. You need to do things that don't make tactical sense in the short term. Jake was already implementing some of the suggested modifications to their vehicles, using materials from the abandoned gas station to alter their visual and acoustic signatures. Rebecca coordinated their new movement plan, incorporating the Alliance's advice with her own tactical knowledge. "We're going to split up temporarily," she announced. Jake and David take the main road for exactly 12 minutes, then veer off onto any available side route. Marcus, Emma, and I will wait here for 10 minutes, then take a completely different direction. We'll rendezvous at these coordinates in 6 hours. The plan was risky, dividing their strength when they were already facing an unknown threat, but it offered their best chance of breaking free from whatever trap was being set. As Jake's truck disappeared down the road, Marcus felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders. The infected tracking them represented a fundamental shift in the nature of their struggle for survival. They were no longer simply avoiding mindless predators, they were engaged in a battle of wits with an enemy that seemed to be learning and adapting. Emma checked her medical supplies one final time, knowing that if their evasion attempt failed, they would likely face injuries unlike anything she'd treated before. The 10 minutes of waiting felt like hours, with every sound potentially signaling the approach of their pursuers. When the time came to move, Marcus started their vehicle with deliberate calm, knowing that panic would only play into whatever strategy the infected were employing. As they pulled away from the gas station, heading in a direction that would take them through unfamiliar territory, Emma caught one last glimpse of the distant figures on the horizon. They had stopped moving, standing motionless like sentinels watching their prey escape, and something about their stillness was more terrifying than any pursuit could have been. The unfamiliar territory stretched before them like an alien landscape, with Marcus navigating through a maze of abandoned industrial complexes and overgrown farmland that seemed untouched by human presence for years. Emma monitored their radio equipment, listening for any sign of Jake and David while simultaneously trying to maintain contact with the Northern Alliance. The silence from both sources was becoming increasingly worrisome as the hours passed, and the weight of isolation pressed down on the 3 survivors like a physical force. Rebecca had taken position in the back seat, her weapons ready and her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings through the rear window. No sign of pursuit, she reported, though her voice carried no relief. But that might not be a good thing. If these evolved variants are as intelligent as we think, they might be planning something we can't anticipate. The absence of visible threats somehow felt more ominous than direct confrontation, leaving them to imagine what kind of trap might be waiting ahead. Their vehicle crested a small hill, revealing a vista that made Marcus immediately slow their pace. Below them lay what had once been a thriving agricultural community, but now the farmhouses stood empty and the fields had been transformed into something that defied explanation. Geometric patterns had been carved into the earth, creating designs that were clearly artificial but served no obvious purpose. Emma leaned forward, studying the strange formations through the windshield. "Those patterns," she said slowly, "they're too precise to be random. Someone or something created them deliberately." As they descended into the valley, the true scale of the modifications became apparent. The geometric designs covered hundreds of acres, with some patterns extending far beyond what they could see from their current vantage point. More disturbing still were the structures that had been built within the patterns, crude but functional constructions that appeared to be made from salvaged materials and organic matter. Rebecca raised her binoculars, focusing on the nearest structure. "There's movement down there," she announced. "But it's not random wandering. Whatever's moving is following the patterns." Marcus brought their vehicle to a stop behind a cluster of abandoned farm equipment, using the rusted machinery as cover while they observed the valley below. Through Emma's medical binoculars, they could see infected moving through the geometric patterns with purpose and coordination that exceeded anything they'd previously witnessed. "They're not just following the patterns," Emma observed, her scientific training helping her analyze what she was seeing. "They're maintaining them. Look at that group near the central structure, they're actually performing what looks like maintenance work." The implications were staggering. If the infected were capable of construction and maintenance activities, it suggested a level of cognitive function that challenged everything the survivors thought they knew about the outbreak. David's voice suddenly crackled through their radio, weak but audible. "Marcus, Emma, Rebecca, do you copy? We've reached the rendezvous coordinates, but there's something here you need to see." The Alliance wasn't entirely honest with us about what we'd find. Relief at hearing from their teammates was quickly replaced by concern about David's cryptic message. Marcus keyed his radio, keeping his voice low to avoid attracting attention from the valley below. "We copy, David. We're about 15 minutes out, but we've encountered something that changes everything. There's an infected settlement down here with construction that suggests advanced planning capabilities." The silence that followed his transmission lasted long enough to make them wonder if they'd lost contact again. Jake's voice came through the radio next, his mechanical expertise evident in his tone. "Marcus, when you get here, bring any recording equipment Emma has. The Alliance people want documentation of what we've all been seeing, but they're being very careful about what information they share. I think they know more about these evolved variants than they've been telling us." The suggestion that their potential allies were withholding crucial information added another layer of complexity to their already dangerous situation. Emma began packing her medical equipment, including a small digital camera she used for documenting injuries and symptoms. "If we're going to record evidence of evolved infected behavior, we need to be systematic about it," she said, her scientific background asserting itself despite the circumstances. "Behavioral observations, environmental modifications, any signs of tool use or construction techniques. This could be the key to understanding how the outbreak has progressed." As they prepared to leave their observation point, Rebecca noticed something that made her grab Marcus's arm. "Look at the central structure," she whispered urgently. "There's something on top of it that wasn't there before." Through the binoculars, they could see a figure standing motionless on the highest point of the crude building. Unlike the other infected they'd observed, this one appeared to be watching their position, as if it had somehow detected their presence despite the distance and concealment. The figure raised what appeared to be an arm, and suddenly the infected throughout the valley stopped their activities and turned toward the hill where the survivors were hidden. Marcus felt his heart rate spike as he realized they'd been discovered by whatever intelligence was coordinating the infected settlement. "We need to move now," he said, starting their vehicle and preparing for rapid departure. "Whatever's down their nose, we're here." As they drove away from the valley, Emma continued to monitor the radio while documenting their observations in her medical journal. The infected settlement represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the outbreak, suggesting that the evolved variants weren't just more dangerous individually, but were capable of creating organized communities. The thought of infected societies developing parallel to human survivor groups opened up terrifying possibilities about the future of both species. Their vehicle climbed out of the valley and back onto the main road leading to the rendezvous coordinates, but Emma couldn't shake the image of that solitary figure watching them from atop the infected settlement. Something about its posture and behavior suggested not just intelligence, but awareness of their significance as observers. As they drove toward their reunion with Jake and David, she began to wonder if they were still the hunters in this post-apocalyptic world, or if they had somehow become the hunted. The rendezvous point turned out to be a fortified checkpoint that bore the distinctive markings of the Northern Alliance, complete with razor wire barriers and watchtowers that suggested a permanent military presence. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as they approached the gates, where Jake and David were already waiting alongside several Alliance soldiers whose equipment and bearing indicated professional military training. The checkpoint's defensive preparations were impressive, but the grim expressions on everyone's faces suggested that even these fortifications might not be adequate against the threats they were facing. Colonel Patricia Hayes emerged from the main command structure, her weathered face and confident stride marking her as someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "You must be the survivor group that's been reporting evolved variant activity," she said, extending a firm handshake to Marcus. "I'm afraid your observations confirm some of our worst fears about how the outbreak has progressed in the Southern Territories." Her directness was refreshing after weeks of uncertainty, but the gravity in her voice suggested that their situation was even more serious than they'd realized. Inside the checkpoint's briefing room, the Alliance had assembled a comprehensive intelligence display that included satellite imagery, survivor reports, and what appeared to be captured infected specimens in containment units. Emma's medical training immediately drew her attention to the specimens, which showed physical modifications that went far beyond anything she'd documented in her field research. "These variants have undergone significant physiological changes," Colonel Hayes explained, noting Emma's interest. "Enhanced muscle density, improved neural connectivity, and most disturbing of all, evidence of deliberate self-modification using available materials." David's technical expertise proved invaluable as he examined the Alliance's communication equipment and data analysis systems. "The radio intercepts I've been gathering are just the tip of the iceberg," he realized, studying displays that showed infected communication patterns across hundreds of miles. "They're not just coordinating locally. There's evidence of long-range communication between different infected settlements, suggesting a network that spans multiple states." The implications were staggering. If the infected were capable of coordinated strategy across vast distances, traditional survival tactics would be completely inadequate. Jake found himself in conversation with Alliance mechanics who had been modifying vehicles for operations against evolved variants. "Standard armor plating isn't enough anymore," explained Sergeant Mike Torres, showing Jake reinforcement techniques that incorporated both metal and organic materials. "The evolved variants have developed tools and weapons. They can breach conventional defenses with coordinated attacks that exploit structural weaknesses." The mechanical challenges of surviving in this new environment required innovations that pushed the boundaries of field engineering. Rebecca's police background made her particularly interested in the Alliance's tactical assessments of evolved variant behavior. "They've developed what we can only describe as military doctrine," Colonel Hayes explained, pointing to tactical maps that showed infected attack patterns. "Reconnaissance, flanking maneuvers, coordinated assaults, even what appears to be prisoner-taking for purposes we don't fully understand." The evolution from mindless predators to tactical opponents represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict. Emma's documentation of the infected settlement proved to be crucial intelligence that filled gaps in the Alliance's understanding of variant capabilities. The construction patterns you observed match similar sites we've identified through satellite surveillance, Colonel Hayes revealed, pulling up aerial photographs that showed dozens of infected settlements across the region. But your ground-level observations provide details we couldn't gather remotely. The maintenance behavior you documented suggests they're not just building, but actively improving their constructions over time. The briefing continued with revelations that challenged everything the survivors thought they knew about the outbreak's progression. We believe the evolved variants represent a form of directed evolution, explained Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the Alliance's chief researcher. The original infected were driven by basic biological imperatives, but these variants show evidence of conscious decision-making about their own development. They're not just adapting to their environment, they're actively modifying themselves to become more effective. As the day progressed, it became clear that the Alliance was preparing for a major operation against the infected settlements, and they wanted the survivor group to participate based on their unique field experience with evolved variants. Your team has observed behaviors that our regular forces haven't encountered, Colonel Hayes explained. We need that expertise for what we're planning. The invitation came with both opportunity and risk. Joining the Alliance would provide resources and support, but it would also mean engaging in direct combat with enemies whose capabilities were still largely unknown. Marcus gathered his team for a private discussion about the Alliance's proposal, weighing the benefits of military support against the dangers of large-scale operations. We've been running and hiding for 3 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated survival decisions. Maybe it's time to take a stand and fight back. Emma nodded in agreement, her medical knowledge making her acutely aware of how the evolved variants threaten not just individual survival, but the future of human civilization itself. The decision to join the Alliance operation was unanimous, but it came with the sobering realization that they were about to engage in warfare against an enemy that had been studying human behavior and developing countermeasures for years. As they prepared for integration into Alliance forces, each team member understood that their survival skills would be tested in ways they'd never imagined. The infected were no longer simply a force of nature to be avoided, they had become an organized enemy that required military-level response to defeat. Rebecca spent the evening studying Alliance tactical manuals and weapons systems, her police training providing a foundation for understanding military operations. The evolved variants have been learning from every encounter with human survivors, she observed. If we're going to succeed, we need to be just as adaptive as they are. The challenge ahead would require not just courage and skill, but the ability to think and fight in ways that the infected couldn't predict or counter. End here story. Wait for part 2. Thank you guys. Like, share, abd, subscribe.